Welcome to tonight's tale, a fairy tale theater podcast. We are going through every episode of Shelley Duvall's Fairy Tale Theater in alphabetical order. Tonight, we are reviewing the episode Sleeping Beauty. I'm your host, Emily. I'm coming to you from Atlanta, Georgia. I'm joined by my co-host, Eric.
Hi, I'm Eric from New York.
And we've got two guest co-hosts, Doug.
Hi, Doug from Australia.
And Jordan.
Hi, Jordan from Pennsylvania.
Great to see you guys. Doug, we've worked with you before, but Jordan, would you like to give a little bit of background about yourself and how long you've been a fan of fairy tale theater?
Yeah, so I've been a lifelong fan pretty much of fairy tale theater from when I used to rent them, two particular episodes, namely Sleeping Beauty, from the local library, especially in the summers, and, then would rent Hansel and Gretel and just kind of became enamored with the series. Used to love watching the previews and obviously loved the box art. But yeah, I'm also an artist, lover of fairy tales, literature, anything fantastical, and of course 80s, so it brings that nostalgia as well. So really excited to discuss this episode with you all, and can't wait to hear your thoughts on it.
Same. Very excited for tonight's episode. Eric, do you have the background information on Sleeping Beauty?
Yes, Sleeping Beauty aired on July 7th, 1983. It was season 2, episode 3. It was directed by Jeremy Kagan, and it was written by Jeffrey Allen Fiskin, and the music director.
Oh, I know who that was. That was Van Dyke Parks, wasn't it?
Yeah, Van Dyke Parks, who we've seen before, correct?
Yeah, he was in Frog Prince.
And Rapunzel.
That's right.
This was also taped. It was actually the 6th episode to be taped. It was taped December 13th, 1982 to December 17th, 1982.
So before the rewatch, what do we all remember? What are the very first things that spring to mind when you think of this episode?
Oh, I'm happy to start this one off. 100%. This is Beverly D'Angelo as Henbane in dragon mode. 100%. That is the thing I think of the most about this episode.
It's not wrong. Jordan?
Yeah, Henbane, Beverly D'Angelo, kind of chewing up the scenery a little bit there. Some of the scariest scenes, some of the most romantic scenes. And of course, Bernadette Peters, she gets to sing Beautiful Beauty. And of course, we have handsome Christopher Reeves. So lots of wonderful Hollywood icons that got to, enter fairy tale realm there. And definitely one of my favorite episodes.
I so agree. Eric?
Yeah, I'll just piggyback off the boys. I mean, Beverly D'Angelo is absolutely everything. As a child, she scared the crap out of me. I used to hide when she took off the mask, when she came out in the full kabuki, dragon-looking thing. And then I've always loved, started my love for Bernadette Peters, who was just beautiful and amazing. And this started my love and obsession of her. And then, of course, we had the very, very handsome Christopher Reeves, who we lost too young, very tragically. So
too young. Agreed.
Yeah. So this is just a great episode. It just showcased so many great talents that we have.
I agree. I wrote down the first thing I thought of is, to my mind, this is one of the more romantic episodes. I remember thinking this just had a lot of romance, which is interesting because the main prince and princess don't even have a conversation, really. But there was the magic, there was the charm there. And of course, Beverly D'Angelo was fierce, Chris Reeves gorgeous, Bernadette's beautiful, and Carol Kane, who is one of my favorite character actresses. She was the other one I thought of. We haven't talked about her yet, but man, she was perfectly cast as the good fairy. Those are my thoughts.
This is my introduction to Carol Kane, I think.
Yeah, same.
Once you hear that voice, you never forget it.
No. And I know Shelley did say when I mentioned Carol Kane, she did remember Carol Kane's voice. So it made a mark on Shelley.
It's
Now, before
interesting.
we get into the episode, can we briefly discuss the CBS Fox cover art for this episode?
We must. It's one of the
I almost
most
feel
beautiful.
obligated to. Yes. So this is one of my favorites. I always felt like this was the quintessential fairy tale theater CBS Fox cover art. There was something about its composition that I just thought was just perfect. And I was also really pleased that we got Beverly D'Angelo on the cover, even though I would have preferred Dragon Mode Henbane to be illustrated, but that wouldn't have worked because she had to be on scale with the other characters. But yeah, a bit of a favorite as well in the series.
Yeah, I agree with that, especially renting it at the library. Would always look at the box before gave it to my mom to rent it out, and loved, like you said, the composition and kind of how it resembled the characters in a stylized version. You could definitely tell that it was, Beverly D'Angelo or Bernadette Peters. But between that and, of course, Hansel and Gretel, those were the two that I always rented at the library, and loved the box art and everything else that was to follow.
And while we're talking art, the production design of this episode is based on the illustrations of Kai Nielsen. However, I'm going to say something here which has always bothered me. I actually feel the production design is actually more in the style of the Russian illustrator, Ivan Bilibin. He did a lot of illustrations that you would know from his Baba Yaga. And there's just so many similarities between his style. I actually don't see any evidence of Kai Nielsen in this episode, but it's what all the commentary says is that Kai Nielsen is the illustrator who they based the production design on.
Oh, Kai Nielsen, I admit I'm not that familiar with his work, but that sounds Danish or Scandinavian to me. And this is very clearly a Russian themed.
This is
episode.
A Russian episode, which is so strange because I did a little bit of research into the origins of the story. I thought maybe there is some Russian version or early version that existed, but no, they really just chose to go in a different direction with this episode and set it in Russia, and the costume design and the set design reflect that beautifully.
The music.
And the music, which, by the way, we just have to quickly talk about. We will get around to it, but the intro music was a piece of traditional Russian music that I've always loved but could never identify. And Emily, just before we recorded this podcast, thank you very much, was able to identify this particular piece of traditional Russian music.
Took me all day.
Time well spent.
But I did find it. I'll post a link in our group when we air this episode. But I was so proud when I found it.
I would agree with that with the art style too. And while obviously a lot of the productions are maybe Maxfield Parrish or Jesse Wilcox Smith, a lot of those productions do look much more like they came out of the storybook pages. Whereas this one, I guess I wouldn't be able to pinpoint the illustrator if we didn't have that information. But maybe it's the Bolshoi Ballet, which is maybe where they pulled some influence from. But still, yes. It definitely has a very noticeable style to it, a very iconic style. And I think it stands out among the rest of the episodes. I don't know if it's because it's one that I grew up with and watched the most. But in hindsight, watching it last night, it definitely has a different feel.
I like that you said that. I completely agree. Maybe that's kind of why we've all got our favorites. I mean, it's no secret how I feel about Princess and the Pea, but that's because it seemed to me to have its own flavor. Sleeping Beauty has its own flavor too. And the ones that I'm most fond of, really, Goldilocks would be another one where you just felt you were, boom, in that world right there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How familiar is everyone with the original tale? Now, I'll go first because here's what I remember. I was a German major. I read pretty much every Grimm's Brothers version I could when I was in college. And what I remember is this follows the Grimm version pretty closely. Disney's Sleeping Beauty also followed the Grimm version pretty closely. I do remember the Charles Perrault French version, and I remember it going off the deep end. But I don't remember all the details. I just remember it followed it up to a point, and then it took a giant left-hand turn.
Oh, yeah.
Am I correct in that?
That is correct. But I'll let the others speak to their memory of the original tale first.
Well, I have so many different recollections of the story, having dozens, hundreds of vintage books, antique editions, where they all start out with a similar, we have a scorned fairy who, for no other reason, curses a princess because she didn't have a golden plate or a dish dome in this case. And, in some versions, there is the dragon. In others, it's just the slumber. And then you never hear from the wicked fairy again, and just lots of different iterations, whether it be in book, film, theater, ballet as well. But that's one of the topics I think that I want to touch on about the different flavors and beats of this version and how they flesh out some of the characters and give the actors a little bit more room to breathe, which I enjoy.
I'm glad you mentioned the ballet. I'm kind of embarrassed to admit we kind of skipped over that. The Tchaikovsky ballet. We've got the music all throughout this episode.
And perhaps the ballet being Russian is what influenced this episode to be set in Russia. It could be as simple as that.
That would make sense.
Mm-hmm.
Eric?
I'm somewhat familiar. Yeah, I know parts of the ballet. I love that all the versions that I grew up with and loved as a kid reference the ballet in some way. So the Disney version does, this does, even the Canon movie Tales does, when the fairies enter and all of that. So I love that,
Yeah.
so that was my whole introduction to the ballet. And then, of course, as I got older, I looked more into that. And then, of course, you have the Grimm brothers version called Briar Rose, which is where the, Disney version directly references that with that name. So that's pretty much like all I know as far as the stories from the years. But I'm sure Doug can go into way more detail than I could.
I will give a little bit of a brief history just to give us some grounding. So Emily's already mentioned the parole version. Look, earlier versions did exist in fairly abstract forms, but the most popular version that is well known, the parole version, was first published in 1697. Later, adapted by the Brothers Grimm, first published in 1812. The difference being, as Emily said, the parole version does take a giant leap in the story, because when you think the story's over, another story begins. Basically, the story is very similar in both versions up to a point when the prince and princess are married. And in the parole version, we have a second act, which involves the prince's evil mother-in-law, who is secretly an ogre. When the prince leaves to go to war, she plots to eat his children and his wife in a cannibalistic fashion. But they escape this treatment by a huntsman substituting animal meat. And then when the prince returns and finds out what his mother was planning, she jumps into a vat of vipers and other creatures that she had prepared to destroy the princess. So, yeah, I don't know where they were going with that, and it seems very unnecessary, but the Brothers Grimm actually adapted that episode into a completely separate story, which makes more sense, called The Evil Mother-in-Law.
That makes a ton more sense because it does seem like two separate fairy tales.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like this poor woman hasn't been through enough, She's just slept for 100 years. She wakes up, has 2 babies, and her mother-in-law is an ogre. Come on.
Go back to bed.
Yes, give me a break.
Yep.
So, yeah, just to touch on that, and as we go through our recap, I'll revisit some things that have been taken directly from the original story and obviously areas where they've elaborated. And then we did touch on the Tchaikovsky ballet, which was premiered in 1890.
Now, if I remember correctly, the French version, when she has the twins, the girl's name is Aurora, and that's where Disney got the name from. Am I remembering that correctly?
I did read this, yeah. So there, the child was named Aurora or Day or Morning, I believe.
Same thing.
Morning, like the sunrise, or something they say in the Disney movie.
Yeah, and would the boy then be like night, the moon?
Something like that, yeah. It was like the twins were like day and night.
Yeah.
So starting our recap, we begin with Shelley's introduction. And she's standing there in that very 1980s puff sleeve dress.
Hello, I'm Shelley Duvall. Welcome to Fairy Tale Theater. Join us for tonight's tale about a handsome prince and a beautiful princess who find that through patience, bravery, and the help of a good fairy, dreams really can come true. Sleeping Beauty.
She looked pretty, but I went, Shelley, lose that dress, please.
Oh, I love 80s Shelley. I will always love 80s Shelley.
Me too.
Yeah, and this might be one of the episodes where the shoulder pads are the most pronounced. A bit of Dynasty in there maybe, but yeah, definitely some of the biggest shoulder pads, I think, out of any intro of any episode.